Welcome, everybody. Um, Welcome to our latest installment of Lady Margaret Hall's Black Histories and Futures series. We're very pleased to be joined this evening by Professor Frederick Ochieng Odhiambo, who is Professor of African Philosophic Sagacity at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus in Barbados. And he's also the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Education there. Professor Ochieng is a native of Kenya. He was trained at the University of Nairobi and spent his early career there and other universities in Kenya before moving to Barbados. His research focuses on philosophic sagacity, which concentrates on the philosophical thought of sagacious individuals within traditional African contexts. He has also written on moral and social philosophy and logic. And if you'll forgive me a personal comment, it was Professor Ochieng who first introduced me to academic philosophy. And I wouldn't be here at LMH reading my DPhil in philosophy if not for his influence. So I'm very overjoyed that he has agreed to join us for this. Today he'll be speaking to us about the communal spirit in African societies, explaining how the emphasis on community rather than individuality in African cultures results in different ontologies, anthropologies, theories of knowledge, and axiologies. And yeah, thank you very much for coming, Professor Ochieng, and please feel free to start when you're ready.
Right, I'm ready. So thank you for that quite elaborate introduction. And I'll also welcome all the viewers and listeners who have come in to join in this particular lecture. I hope, it is my hope and intention that at the end of it all, at least each and every one of you would have learned something. Even if you don't agree, but at least it would provoke you into thinking deeply on various issues. Now, as you've been told, I'll basically talk on the communal spirit in African societies, and I'll base myself on three scholars. This is Further Placid Temples, John Beatty, and Ifeanyi Menkiti. Now, with regard to Temples, his text, which I have in mind, is titled Bantu Philosophy, first published in English in 1959. And John Beatty's text, which I have in mind, is African Religions and Philosophy, first published in 1969. Now, regarding Menkiti, I have his article titled Person and Community in African Traditional Thought. It was published in a text edited by R.A. Wright, African Philosophy and Introduction, in 1984. Now, before I begin, I want to make it clear that though I'll be talking about Africa and Bantu in some cases, I'll be using the two terms interchangeably, as if they're one and the same, though of course in reality we know that they are not. Whereas all Bantus are Africans, not all Africans are Bantu. So for instance, I am an African, but I'm not a Bantu. I belong to the Nilotic tribe. But I'll be using Bantu here and there because that's the terminology Temples uses, but we'll use it interchangeably with Africa. Now also, Africa is a vast continent. There are almost, I think, 3,000 different ethnic groups, speaking about 2,100 languages in Africa. So it's a land of diversity. So even when I'm talking of Africa, it might give the impression that it is monolithic, but really it is diverse, right? One may be accused of the fallacy of overgeneralization, but all the same, despite that criticism, there's something which runs through a vast majority of the various ethnic groups with respect to communalism. Now, I'll start by looking at what Temples in his text refers to as ontology, Bantu ontology, or rather African ontology. Now, according to Mbiti, the difference between Western and Bantu thought, right, is traceable to the radically different ways in which the two groups look at reality and their conceptions of ontology. Right? So whereas, for instance, the Westerners or Europeans, I'm using it to mean Europeans, the universe consists of atomic beings, For Africans, it consists of forces, not atomic beings, but forces. Right? And according to Temples, the universe of forces for the African is a hierarchy, which starts from God at the very top of the hierarchy, God, right? The all-powerful force. And it descends through the ancestors, right? The next category, the living human beings, that's the third category, animals, the fourth category, plants, fifth category, down to the inorganic world, that is inanimate objects. Right? So that's the hierarchy, right, within the Bantu ontology. Now, African or Bantu forces are interdependent, reinforcing and diminishing each other according to fixed laws. Right? So in other words, these forces do not just interact haphazardly, no. They obey some fixed laws. There are some basic underlying principles which govern their interaction. Right? So the forces of God, the forces of the ancestors, those of human beings, animals, and plants, all those vital forces interact according to some fixed laws, or if you like, scientific laws. Right? So that's the Bantu ontology. So according to Bantu ontology or African ontology, you cannot have a space which is empty. So the concept of a vacuum doesn't make sense in African worldview, right? Because even that empty space has force, which makes it what it is. So force is actually a metaphysical notion which gives being, rather makes something what it is, distinguishes it from something else, so to speak. Right? So that's their ontology. Right? So they intermingle. Now, regarding epistemology, the theory of knowledge, right? One would want to say that, number one, first, for Africans or Bantu, true knowledge or wisdom is ontological knowledge, is ontological. Right? It has to do with knowledge of the various forces, their hierarchical ordering, and their interaction. That's what knowledge is all about. Right? So a knowledgeable person, a wise person, is this person who is grounded in the various, it knows how the various forces interact and the results which would accrue therefrom. So a knowledgeable person, for instance, knows that if one's human vital force is being diminished, right, one is not well, one is not sick, his vital force is being interfered with negatively, then this knowledgeable person would know which vital force to mix with that person's vital force as a way of enhancing that person's vital force. That's the knowledgeable person. It's not the person who has read many books, no. Two, knowledge is also a kind of force for Africans. It follows from this, therefore, that knowledge, like being in the ontology, is also hierarchical, in some hierarchy. So, for instance, the higher the ontological status of a being, right? The higher the ontological status of a being, the more it can be said to know. Right? So, on that third category of human beings in the ontology of human beings, it's also hierarchical. So that at the top of that hierarchy, you have persons who know more, are grounded in the knowledge of forces, right? So it follows, therefore, that age is very important. Or in Swahili, they have a proverb that kuishi kwingi ni kuona mengi. Right? Wisdom comes with age, so to speak. Right? So that's what knowledge is, briefly. Now, even African psychology, right, their notion of a person, what a person is, right, they see a person as a living force, a force, right? They see a person in terms of force, a living force. Right? The force of the being that possesses a life that is true, full, and lofty, so to speak. The human being, the person, is the dominant force. Right? Very important. He or she is the dominant force amongst all the created visible forces. In other words, human being is the supreme force, the most powerful, but amongst the created beings. A human being dominates plants, animals, and the minerals, those under him or her in the hierarchy. These lower beings, so to speak, were created by divine decree only for the purpose of assisting a human being in sustaining him or herself. Right? So one would say, therefore, that the African ontology is very anthropocentric, revolves around a human being, right? Very anthropocentric. Though human beings, the living human beings, occupy the third position in the hierarchy, but everything else revolves around them. Right? One would define God only in terms of man. The ancestors, the second category, these were once human beings. The categories below man were created by the first category, God, so as to sustain human beings, so to speak. Even ethics, African ethics or Bantu ethics, revolves around the notion of vital force. Okay? So, life belongs to God. That's the first premise. Right? It is God who summons it into being, right? Strengthens and preserves it. Now, God's great and holy gift to human being is the gift of life. Other things, other creatures exist in the divine will only to maintain excuse me. Sorry about that. Right? So, all other beings were created by the divine will only to maintain and cherish the vitality of the human being. Right? And therefore, any act, any action, any conduct, any behavior, right, that preserves or strengthens human vitality is a good action. But on the other hand, any action, any conduct, any behavior which diminishes the vitality of a human being is bad. Right? So even the ethics, good and bad, in terms of human conduct, it's seen under the background of vital force, under that conception of vital force. Right? One cannot divorce their ontology, African ontology, from their epistemology, from their psychology, from their ethics, so to speak. Right? Because everything revolves around human being. It is very anthropocentric. Right? So therefore, based on that, one can say that one outstanding difference between African and Western cultures, right? Between African and Western cultures, and again, here I must say that I'm using Western in a very broad, almost one may say careless sense. I'm using it to mean European, right? So one basic difference between traditional African cultures and European Western cultures is that while the former, that is African cultures, stress human community, the latter, that is Western cultures, emphasize the individual. It is the individual who is important. Now, this difference is what underlies and therefore explains other differences or divergences, if you like, between the two cultures. It explains their different ontologies, their different anthropologies, their different epistemologies, their different axiologies, their ethics, etc., etc. And that's why John Mbiti, argued that in a traditional African setup, philosophy and religion, right? Philosophy and religion are intertwined. He bracketed the two and argued that one cannot understand African philosophy without understanding their religion. The two are necessarily intertwined. So according to Mbiti, in Africa, therefore, one cannot talk of a people being irreligious. You cannot have irreligious persons in traditional Africa. Traditional Africans do not know how to live, right? This is important, to live outside the confines of religion stroke philosophy. For living without religion means living outside the community, of which one is a part, and that amounts to some form of self-contradiction. It would be contradictory. Right? Because in the traditional African setup, to be human is to belong to the whole community. To be human is to belong to the whole community. And to do so involves participating in the beliefs, ceremonies of that community. Right? And therefore, a person, the traditional African setup, cannot detach him or herself from the religion of the group. Right? Because doing so amounts to cutting one's roots, one's foundation, one's contact of security, cutting oneself from his or her kinships and the entire group of those who make him aware of his existence. Right? To be without one of these corporate elements of life is to be out of the whole picture, the total picture. Right? And indeed, BT argues, says that accordingly, therefore, it is the community that gives meaning and significance to the individual. Right? And hence, BT's famous dictum, right? His famous saying that I am because we are. And since we are, therefore I am. Right? I repeat again. I am because we are. And since we are, therefore I am. Right? Now that dictum is the underlying principle of Ubuntu. Ubuntu. This is a philosophy of being amongst the Bantu in Southern Africa. Right? It is the underlying principle of Ubuntu. Right? Ubuntu is part of the Zulu phrase, actually Zulu phrase, Umuntu, Gubuntu, Gabantu. Right? Umuntu, Ubuntu, Gabantu, which literally means that a person is a person through other persons. Right? A person is a person through other persons. In other words, one affirms one's humanity when that person acknowledges the humanity of others. Right? In other words, it is the others, that is the we, which determines the I, the individual, so to speak. Now, that traditional African worldview, therefore, realize focuses on a person within his or her social context, social environment. The individual is not thought of as a singular independent being living in sublime segregation. No. The individual is not meaningful by himself or herself. Right? He or she derives meaning from the totality, from the community, from the group. Right? And this brings us to what Ifeanyi Menkiti says in his article. Right? Menkiti's analysis of the notion of personhood is necessarily linked to that of community. He argues that in traditional Africa, the notion of personhood is necessarily connected or linked to that of community. It is the community that defines the person as a person. A personhood is not some isolated, static quality of rationality, will, or memory, as understood in Western European thought. No. Right? Africans, therefore, Menkiti underscores that Africans, emphasize on the rituals of incorporation and the overarching necessity of learning the social rules by which the community lives. In other words, the traditional African notion of personhood is more normative than metaphysical. The Western European conception of personhood, on the other hand, is somehow emphasizes on something different. It basically seeks, right, to analyze the ontological makeup of a person. Right? That's where the emphasis is on analyzing or explicating the ontological makeup of a person, as opposed to the traditional African, which is more normative than ontological, more normative than descriptive, more normative than metaphysical, so to speak. Right? The Western notion examines whether a person, the concern is whether a person is material or immaterial. Whether a person is a soul or rational or will, trying to explain a person in terms of will or in terms of memory. Right? So one would want to say that the emphasis of personhood in traditional Africa and in the Western European societies are quite different. And of course, all these differences arise from the fact that traditional African worldview is communalistic as opposed to the Western European worldview, which is individualistic, so to speak. Right? Now, I want to use the naming system to show this communal spirit in African traditions. Well, I'll use the naming system and marriage. Right? Of course, one can use several institutions, but I've picked on those two. And of course, the naming system, which I have in mind, is that of the Luo, right? Luo of Kenya. As I told you, I belong to the Luo ethnic group, right? So most of my researches, I've conducted them amongst the Luo people, right? Okay, so now the Luo identify 4 ways, right? There are 4 ways which they follow when they give names to their children, right? 4. But here I'll just briefly explicate 3, the first 3. The 4th one, God willing, I'll explicate next time, all right? Now, the Luo, you want to say, never simply think of a name as something to which a person responds to when called out, or for merely differentiating one person from another. No, that's not it. Right? Names play a much more important role than that. Right? So the first way, the first level, I usually call them level. The first level of naming is the names given to infants, the young ones, children, when they are born. Right? That's the first level. Now, here we want to say that amongst the Luo, and several, of course, other African ethnic groups, at this first level, children are mostly given names according to when they are born. When, right? The when, right? When they are born, such as the position of the sun at birth, whether it is morning, midday, evening, etc., or the time of birth could be at night, either early night, midnight. Right? So that determines the name a child would get. Right? So besides the when, the how also could determine, right? How they were born, how the child was born could also determine the name given to that child. So whether the child was born facing down, entangled by the umbilical cord, or covered with a amniotic membrane, that could also determine the name. Okay? So besides the when and how, the where also, where they are born, could also determine the name given to a child. So, for instance, whether the child was born under the eaves of a house, in the village, or behind a house, or in the field, under a tree, or along the path, etc., etc. Or the child could also be named regarding the general situation when the child was born. Right? So, for instance, whether there was locust invasion, famine, whether it was an overcast day, it was during wartime, whether it was floods, whether it was rainy, whether it was grasshopper invasion, etc., etc. Those would determine a child's name. So in other words, here, amongst the Luo, therefore, from somebody's name, you can tell something about that person. So, for instance, my name, of course, one of my names is Ochieng, which is really, one of my names. I got it through this first category, right? Chieng in Luo means sun, 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 moon, the sun, S-U-N, sun. Right? So Ochieng means of the sun. So really, literally, it means someone who was born when the sun was hot. That's around midday. Right? So Ochieng means a male child who was born around midday. That's when I was born. Right? So anybody, a Luo, for instance, who sees my name, even without seeing me, would know something about me in terms of when I was born. Right? If one was born when it was raining, right, could be called Okoth, right? Okoth, which means of the rain. Right? But of course, amongst the Luo, when the name begins with O, generally speaking, when the name begins with O, that's masculine. Right? But the feminine version is A. So the feminine version of Ochieng is Achieng. So when you see the name Achieng, it means it's a female who was born around midday, etc. So the name speaks to the person, right? Because a person is not just an individual, right? But is connected as well to the environment, right? So use things, relational things, to explain the person's birth, so to speak. There's that communal spirit, though here it's not individual, but with connection with other things, right? Now, of course, somebody who, a Luo, when he sees my name, would be a bit confused when they see Ochieng Odhiambo, right? Because it would mean Odhiambo means one who was born, a male child who was born, a male who was born in the evening. So but I carry the two, which means I was born during daytime, midday, and in the evening. Bit confusing. Right? But of course, here I carry that name Odhiambo. It's not actually my name, it is my father's name, right? Which in the Western European world, they refer to as the surname, right? And that's how I acquired it. So technically, it is not my name, right? It is my father's name. My name is Ochieng. Second level of naming names, second level, has to do with names from dreams and ancestors. Names from dreams and ancestral names. Right? So here we want to say that, sometimes amongst the Luo and other African communities, some others, sometimes when the father or mother has given a child a name according to that first category, but the child, for some reason, still continue crying, is rather uneasy, right? It's not that it is hungry, it's not that it is wet, but it is fidgety, crying, nonstop. If that happens, then the implication is that there is a dead relative, as yet unknown to the parents, who would like the child also to be named after him or her. So if this happens, when a child starts crying, then what happens is that the parents, the father and the mother, would together start calling out names of dead relatives, right? They start calling names of dead relatives. And the one at whose call the child stops crying, that name, will say the name has stuck. So it is that name, given that the child will be given that name. Right? So that, in a way, therefore, that ancestor would be conceived as the guardian, angel guardian of that child. Right? At times as well, still in that category, The parents, one of the parents may have a dream, right? And during the dream, maybe this ancestor, right, may come to the dream and request that the child be named after him or her. Again, if that happens, they will name the child after that ancestor. So again, here, the idea is therefore, it's relational, right? You are connected to somebody else. There's that communal aspect coming in. And then there's the third category. These are names that show kinship. The third level, this third level of names indicates the relatives by whose name a person is called. So the names which one gets based on this third category usually show the relation between two persons. Right? At this level, because relatives are many, right, a Luo tends to have several names. Right? So if I start explaining all my names, it would be endless, right? Because a person could be called by the name of the father, the mother, grandfather, grandmother, an uncle, son, daughter, wife, husband, girlfriend, boyfriend, colleague, etc., etc. But then the important point in this category is that when you call the person with somebody else's name, you must indicate the relation. You must indicate the relation. So I am not just Odhiambo, right? No, that is my father. I am Ward Odhiambo, which translates to son of Odhiambo. So you don't just call me Odhiambo, you must indicate the relation. Because Odhiambo is my father. You have to say Ward Odhiambo, son of Odhiambo. You can call me using the name of my mother, but again, you must indicate the relation. You can call me using Justin's name, but you must indicate the relation. Japuonj Justin, lecturer or teacher of Justin, right? And it is construed as a name. Right? So one could have as many names as one has relatives. Right? So it is quite equivalent to English when you talk of Mrs. Odhiambo, right? Which means wife of Odhiambo. Right? But then in the Luo context, even a husband could be called using the wife's name. So you could call me using my wife's name. But the point is you must indicate the relation. Right? Because all these other persons, all these other things, right, the environment and these other persons all conjure up into making me what I am. There's that communal spirit, if you see what I mean, if that makes sense, right? And it's not just naming, right? Even things like commerce, trade, buying something, right? When you go to a shop to buy something, when you go to the market to buy something, right? In the Western world, right? In the Western world, it is assumed that, buying, right? This activity of buying something, right, is a kind of impersonal economic transaction, right? It's an impersonal economic transaction. And, the prices are more or less fixed, right? Okay? And one is not only interested in the person, as the seller or buyer, okay, he's not interested in that. He's interested in what the good he wants, right? What you want to buy, not the seller. Right? So you want to get that thing and be done with it. Right? So when I walk into this market, I want to buy this book, I ask whoever is selling it, how much is this book or how much are the mangoes? The prices are fixed. It is £1 or $2 fixed, right? I produce my money, give it to him or her, I get my stuff, and I walk out. I'm done. It's a personal, impersonal, economic transaction. Right? In traditional Africa, is a bit different. In traditional Africa, it's a bit different. They view buying not as an impersonal economic transaction, but as a social person-to-person transaction. And therefore, they will, the buyer and the seller will take some time bickering over the price, for instance, right? Bickering over the price. But all that is because they want to establish some kind of relationship. Assumption is that some kind of relationship should be established between the buyer and the seller. So I ask for how much is this mango? And I'm told it is, what, 50 cents? I would say, no. I don't have that 50 cents. I have 30 cents. Of course, the buyer, the seller would say, no. I can't sell it to you at 30 cents because I'll not be making any profit. All right, bring 40 cents. All right. In other words, you're establishing a relationship. In some cases, even before you state, the buyer states what he or she wants, he'll greet the person. How are you? How is your family? Of course, it's not a relative, but how is your family? Are they okay? Yes, the weather it's a nice weather today. Right? In other words, you want to establish a relationship first, right? Because buying is not just seen as an impersonal economic transaction, but you want to establish a relationship. So when you go in a typical traditional African market, they bicker over price, they talk, because you want to establish a relationship. Right? So marriage as well is quite different. In the West, it is assumed to be a contract between two persons, the bride and the bridegroom, right? Between the two of them. Of course, the two of them, the bride and the bridegroom, can consult their parents, right? But that is out of courtesy, right? Out of courtesy. It's not a must, but out of courtesy. You just inform them that, okay, we are getting married, blah, 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 but not really asking for their consent because marriage is between these two. But in traditional African society, no. Marriage is not simply between the two, no. Right? In traditional African societies, it's more or less the families marry each other. The two families come together. The two villages come together. The two clans come together. It's not one person marrying the other, no. Right? So before marriage takes place, so many persons are consulted. So many people play a role in it. Right? And precisely that's why, for instance, in traditional African systems, even with the death of a spouse, that does not dissolve the marriage because the marriage was not between two individuals, it was between two families, between two clans. So even if the spouse dies, that doesn't dissolve the marriage. But of course, in the West, given that it was a contract between two individuals, when one spouse goes down, then the marriage automatically ceases, is dissolved. But in traditional Africa, even if your spouse dies, in Luo, we still refer to you as Chilia, which means wife of the grave.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Yeah, that was wonderful as always. Thank you, first of all, Professor Ochieng, for speaking.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it very much. I'd also like to thank my co-organizers for this series, Dilar Dirit, Gassio Zunian, Nadine Elzine, and Katrina Palmer. And I'd love to thank Tom Hughes for all of his help in putting this together. He did all the promotion and tech support for this, so thank you so much. And thank you all of you for coming and spending the evening with us.